Emmanuel Macron, the Jupiterian French president, too smart for journalists, has experienced plummeting popularity for a while. And now, with the introduction of the diesel tax rise, he's facing riots and calls for him to leave office. I must admit I've enjoyed his personality quirks and imperial pronouncements for a while, but this is deadly serious for the French citizens affected by it. This ain't no meme, this ain't no game. Macron brought in some fuel tax rises in 2017 as part of his larger plan to discourage people from using fossil fuels as much. He proposed a ban on the sale of internal combustion vehicles by 2040. These measures are all designed to help fight climate change. The latest law, which will take effect in January 2019, is a rise in the tax on diesel fuel to bring it into line with the rise in tax on petrol fuel brought in during 2017. This was the last straw. Violence has broken out. I made a video a while ago titled Positive and Negative Environmentalism, though perhaps you could call it additive and subtractive environmentalism to avoid confusion with positive and negative rights. But the core concept is that there are two different ways to engage in environmental policy. One is the negative approach where you penalise dirty energy, raise consumption taxes on things that use it, or outright ban things. The other approach is where you instead subsidise green energy. If the state is to take action, it should, in my view, be to buy up R&D into green energy tech. Solar panels, nuclear fusion, electric cars and better batteries, etc. Now, obviously funding this either requires taxation or borrowing. So you could say that even positive environmentalism does have a small negative aspect. And we can argue about how large or small the level of funding should be. But the difference is you are going to be a lot more flexible in how you can fund these programs compared to when the goal is outright discouragement of consumption. The burden of a tax that is merely designed to fund something can be shifted around and weighted in a progressive bracket system. Meanwhile, the impact of research and development versus discouraging consumption is totally asymmetric, so it would likely require less funding in the first place. With negative environmentalism, consumption taxes which are designed to discourage consumption, at least when they apply to everyday things and not just luxury goods, are going to be highly regressive, in economist terminology. That is, the largest burden of the taxes as a percentage of income is going to fall on the poor. I mean, if the tax is being put in place merely to discourage demand, then that's entirely the point, just like the sin taxes on cigarettes. When you do this, you are quite deliberately and very directly lowering the living standards of the majority of the populace as a trade-off against your environmental goals. Macron claims that these negative measures were needed to support the positive measure of subsidisation, but that's simply not true. In my opinion, existing subsidies were enough, but that's another story. In any case, large-scale regressive taxation always meets resistance, just as Thatcher's poll tax did in the UK. Moreover, you want to increase the size of the pie before you start removing pieces, but Macron has had a disastrous tenure that has decreased the size of the pie. It's only in an over-regulated French economy that you would even think this was necessary. These negative measures are rather desperate. I said this wouldn't work, because it would lower first world living standards, causing a very large direct backlash. And here we are. Here is just one example in one country. You might say that Macron was very unpopular for other reasons, but this still mattered enough to be the final straw. So this is a real-world example playing out in front of us of the concepts I described as positive and negative environmentalism. Macron was engaging in negative environmentalism, and he received riots in response. Lowering the living standards of first world people is not a solution to climate change. I mean, we could get into how it's pointless anyway, since China is actually the most responsible single country in terms of emissions at this point, or my belief that the higher representative concentration pathways for climate change are less likely, and we have to evaluate climate change in a less apocalyptic light and make adaptations instead. But even taking all that aside, the policy of hurting people's wallet to save the planet is simply dead on arrival. It doesn't work, it's a dud, a non-starter. Macron could have just focused solely on existing subsidisation? Did it even need to be expanded? But if he did, even small expansions would have an outsized effect. Subsidising solar R&D, hydrogen, electric cars and research into nuclear fusion. These are the real game changers. You need to change the game. If you discourage fossil fuels but there's nothing to actually replace them, what then? Fossil fuels aren't going to last forever. And peak conventional oil in the US, for example, already was reached in the 70s. Now we're already into tar sands and fracking and exotic drills that have to bend to reach oil. So even without climate change, the focus should be on concentrating money onto scientists researching the replacement to fossil fuels. And when you concentrate resources onto smart people, again, that's asymmetric to taking money out of people's pockets. So there is an exchange going on where you take money out of people's pockets to concentrate it onto smart people. But that's very different than if the goal is to simply take money out of people's pockets so they can't spend it on the thing you don't like. This is what leads to a much larger, more pervasive measure. Having a subsidy-focused conception of the issue not only means you're more likely to limit the funding to progressive brackets, but it's going to cost less and take less from the economy. If the economy declines and goes into the shitter, what productive capacity is going to be spared to fund these programs? You might end up with very high levels of inflation, and all that money you're shifting around is worthless. So no, Macron didn't have to either take these tough but supposedly necessary measures, or throw his hands up in the air. He could have fought smarter, not harder, but because he is travelling down the well-worn negative environmentalist path, he's heading towards a cliff he could have entirely avoided had the other road been taken. This bolsters my hypothesis. So, rats to Macron, and vive la France!